Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Joyce E. King, Benjamin E. Mays Endowed Chair for Urban Teaching, Learning, and Leadership, and Professor of Educational Policy Studies in the College of Education and Human Development at Georgia State University. Hi, Dr. King. How are you doing today?
Fine, thank you. Happy to be here with you.
We're so excited to have you. I want to start by asking you a little bit how you got into Black studies and what keeps you committed into the field of Black studies.
Well, I think I can say that I was there as a participant at the early stage as a student activist at Stanford, a 60s person. I was one of the students that helped establish African and African American studies at Stanford. And so my early formation as a student came along with the development of the modern studies movement in higher ed. And I have stayed with it because it is our answer to what we need as a people. And so it's evolved. I mean, even this podcast series is just a testimony to the development of the field, where some people are focused on the sort of institutionalization. I've been on the epistemological side. What is the nature of the knowledge that we need? And what kind of research can we do to advance our intellectual tradition?
So I want to follow up on that a little bit. One, and ask you, what was it like to be at Stanford in that particular moment with some of the founders of the field and working towards making sure that the field was ultimately institutionalized? What was that experience like?
Well, I went to Stanford as a freshman in 1965. So we were coming in the midst of the civil rights movement. My class was the largest class of Black students that Stanford had ever had. Before my class of 25, Black students were maybe 4 or 3 in the other classes ahead of me. So it was like integrating Stanford. And after Martin Luther King was assassinated, Black students were organized. There was organizing going on at San Francisco State. I mean, this was just the stage where we were in terms of the movement. And so what was it like? It was like liberation. It was like understanding what has been wrong and participating in making things right. So I was born and raised in California, and I did not have the kind of education that many other people had learning about Black history. I had never heard of the Harlem Renaissance when I went to Stanford, and I was in an overseas study program in Italy. I was in Florence reading about the Harlem Renaissance in a library in Florence in Italian. So, what was it like? It was like what many of my students today say, I didn't know that. I didn't know about that. I didn't know that. So, it was just liberating and learning, reading. Sinclair Drake, we brought him to head up our program, and he brought many of the most important figures that you can think about. C.L.R. James, Bobby Hill was a graduate student at UCLA. He came to tell us about Marcus Garvey. I mean, it was the heyday of Black liberation.
Thank you. One of the things that struck me um, in one of the articles that you provided, the article on staying human, the 40 years of Black studies, practical critical activity in the spirit of Aunt Jemima, was the importance of community, right? And that when you were going to Stanford, you went and met a local pastor. There was that intentionality of making sure that there was a connection to the surrounding community outside of the university. And I know you talk a lot about that in general in Black studies and the importance of Black studies being connected to community. Do you want to, or can you elaborate a little bit on that link to community and the importance of that, both then and now in Black studies?
Well, my parents were not formally higher education people. My mother actually, by the time I was a senior at Stanford, my mother was a maid at the Holiday Inn across the street from Stanford. But when I came as a freshman, my mother took me to the community of East Menlo Park before we went on campus. And my mother's inclination was, let me take you to our people. So she took me to a church that our pastor had indicated to us was a church that was in our fellowship. And I met the pastor. My mother said, I'm bringing my daughter here and want her to know about you. And then we went to Stanford. So that was my experience. Something else that happened when I was a freshman, I had two roommates. One, her father was actually on the faculty. She was Native American. And the other girl was from Texas. And she let me know that she'd never been around any Black people. And my grandmother called on the phone one day, and I talked to my grandmother in the room, and my two roommates were sitting by. And so when I hung up, they looked at me like I was from another planet. They said, we couldn't understand a thing you said while I was talking to my grandmother. And I realized, okay, well, if I'm not careful when I leave here, I won't be able to communicate with my family. Something is going on here that's different from who I am. So the community part is about identity. Now you get into, well, what is education? Education, from their perspective, is to take you away from where you come from, to give you, a way out. And so I resisted that as a student. And in my teaching and research, it had become, over the years, very important to make sure that we value community knowledge and who we are. Part of that is social class, but it's also the whole philosophy of devaluing indigenous knowledge, devaluing people's history, and making you think that you've come to this place to become something that you're not. So Black studies, African American studies at Stanford, we brought the program in with a commitment to be aligned with the Black community, which was East Palo Alto, East Menlo Park. And at the same time, in East Palo Alto, East Menlo Park, Nairobi College was established, which is a whole nother history of Black people establishing an independent private education system from preschool all the way up to college. So I was a part of the Nairobi College movement. I taught my first sociology class as an undergraduate in the shopping center where Nairobi College had classes, and my class was next door to the liquor store. And when my class was over, my students went next door and brought me a Mai Tai, not an apple, but a Mai Tai. And so that was a very unique historical period in Black education development. This sense of self-determination, the idea that who we are and what we know should inform the way we are educated and how we are educating others. And so that's been an integral part of who I am as a scholar.
Thank you. So building on that, you got your bachelor's in sociology from Stanford with honors, and you also have a PhD in the social foundations of education. And so much of the work that you've done does speak to like what education is and what it can be if we're taking a Black perspective on it. How do you see the work that you do as pushing back against some of the more Eurocentric and traditional disciplinary boundaries of the field of education?
Black studies is interdisciplinary. It has been from the beginning. It had to be from the beginning because the traditional academic disciplines were built on the erasure of Black knowledges. So I have degrees in sociology, but my experience of teaching and learning has been grounded in Black studies, which goes beyond a single discipline. When I was an undergrad sociology major, I recognized that the theoretical perspectives that we were being introduced to did not speak to my experience.
Mhm.
So I was working in the Black community, I was tutoring in the Black high school, and I'm seeing kids who can't read. So I go to my department chair and I say, I'm a sociology major because I thought sociology was supposed to help us address social problems. The department chair asks me if I work with crossword puzzles. And I said, "Excuse me?" And he said, "Well, I don't think you have the intellectual capacity to do sociology. I think you should go down the road and study social work." Okay, so well, what are we going to do with this? So I graduated from the Department of Sociology with a BA with honors because I didn't accept that erasure of what was motivating me to study in the first place.
Mm.
So I did a project in that same high school, created a methodology for studying those problems, and felt like I was able to make a contribution. So at every stage of my career, the discipline has been problematic and has been an obstacle to be overcome. When I was in the doctoral program, studying for a PhD in the sociology or the social foundations of education, my qualifying exam was to write on Arthur Jensen's article, just published 1969 in the Harvard Ed Review, on the heritability of the inferiority of Black people. That's my qualifying exam. So these are the barriers that Black studies has transcended from the beginning of the discipline. And so we draw on literature, we draw on science, we draw on history to tell a more complete and accurate story, not only of our experience as people of African descent from a Pan-African perspective, but of the world. So we end up correcting everybody's story while we correct what's being presented to us about who we are.
Thank you. I think the point about correcting everybody's story is so important, um, and it really speaks to not only the utility of looking at things from a Black perspective, um, but also the importance, right? Like, everybody's story is when it's told through a Eurocentric traditional framework, it's all wrong. It's not just about how Black people are talked about, it's about how everybody's talked about and the dehumanization that goes along with that inaccuracy. Um, One of the things that you emphasized is the importance of, and you just mentioned it when you were speaking to the importance of, like, when you were doing your sociology degree, solving social problems. Like, where's the practice, right? So the linking of theory to practice. And I know there are a number of examples of that in your career. Um, but I did want to ask you about the Jemima Leadership Circle. I found, the story about Aunt Jemima so interesting. I had never heard that before, and I love it. But also how you were able to take that story and then start a program around it that helped multiple women be able to rethink and rewrite knowledge about who Aunt Jemima was or who the aunts in their lives have been.
Well, that's a very interesting example of the holistic approach to knowledge in Black studies, because what you have in that experience is the importance of spirituality, a Pan-African affirmation of who we are, and that happened in like many examples or things that I've experienced. You would say, well, just happenstance. I said spirit. I was listening to the Emmett Powell gospel show on a Saturday morning, minding my own business, but consciousness is something that's important to me and has been an essential element of what I study. I want to know, well, what makes it possible for us to be conscious? And so the gospel show was playing on a Saturday morning, and Mr. Powell had an African priestess on the show that day to talk about traditional African healing and spirituality. And the Pentecostal people in the audience called in to criticize him for having this African person on the show. And she told the story of who Aunt Jemima really was. And when she talked about African spirituality and African, well, you could say religion, she talked about how these Ifa priestesses allowed themselves to be captured so that they could come here and look after us in the diaspora. And she said, we call them Aunt Jemima. Well, we call them Jemima or Yemaya. So the people in the audience, the same Pentecostal people, call back and apologize. I said, oh my God, what just happened? So this is how knowledge of ourselves can be healing and transformational. So I took that story that she told about the Ifa priestesses, and I was already organizing women in the community to have conversations. We were looking for something that would allow us to be of service in our community. And so when I told them about this story, my mother said, oh, yeah, that reminds me of when we were growing up. We could call these powerful women in our community Mrs. We had to call them Aunt because Mrs. was reserved for the white women. So now my head is exploding. You mean Aunt is that? This is who we really were? So this is just an example of being able to hear from our own people's experience and use our intellectual tools to interpret and use that knowledge. So then we went from that to the Jemima Leadership Circle. And women in the community began to share that story of Aunt Jemima. They would call me up. I didn't even know these ladies. Can you tell us the real story of Aunt Jemima? So, it reverberates. It's the healing power of knowledge and accurate interpretation. And you've used the word Black perspective. That's something that has come along with the development of Black studies, because what we were told as students is, well, you're being biased. Aren't you supposed to be neutral and objective? But what you're giving me is neither neutral or objective. You're giving me your thing, which is supposed to put me in a place that I can never get out of if I use your thing. So, Aunt Jemima, that story of the Jemima Leadership Circle is an interesting example of the power of knowledge. And I had a Kellogg Fellowship at that time that allowed me to go to Geneva and meet with Sister Jean Sendab, who was running the World Council of Churches Racism Program. And I told her about what I was doing. She gave me a grant, and that's how I was able to support the work of the Leadership Circle.
Thank you. That was, I really enjoyed reading about that. So I appreciate you elaborating on it here as well. I know that will touch a lot of people, because that was mind blowing to me. I had never heard it before. One of the other things I wanted to ask you about specifically, and I'm gonna pronounce this wrong, I'm pretty sure, but also about the Songhoy Club.
Yes, you got it right. Mm-hmm.
In the integration of that language into teaching, and how that also helped to rely on more indigenous knowledges and Black ways of knowing to shift perspective and worldview.
Yes. The history of our story before enslavement and the peopling of the continent from ancient Egypt to the West to the diaspora.
Mhm.
So we use the work of the late Dr. Edward Robinson, who wrote a book called The Journey of the Songhai People. So you have Ghana, Mali, Songhai. And Dr. Edward Robinson's analysis is that we in the diaspora are the continuation of the Songhai people, which was the last great classical West African empire. And the Songhai people trace their origins back to ancient Kemet. So now we're talking about the history of humanity, who we are as a people, and the whole Pan-African perspective. We call it a Black perspective. It's the perspective of the African experience, African. A friend of mine in the community got a grant to do an after-school program in Atlanta at a middle school. And so at Georgia State, I had graduate students who were teachers, award-winning teachers. And I asked my students, do you know what to say to young Black people to get them to embrace our African identity? And my doctoral students, who were award-winning teachers, said, no, I'm not sure what to say. And they're teaching kids every day. So I said, okay, we're going to do this after-school club, and we're going to make it a pedagogical lab so that you as teachers can answer that question, solving that problem. I had another student who came to me who said, Dr. King, is there anything really called African-centered education? I said, yes. She said, well, a professor told me that it doesn't exist. I said, well, come along to my class and you can answer that question for yourself. So for a year, I had graduate students, including a white student, teaching the Songhai Club after school, starting with our human origins, ancient Egypt, all the way to what we call I developed a framework called the 3N framework, from the Nile to the Niger to the neighborhood. So we had middle school kids together after school. We had drumming, but we also used the Songhai language to decode some of the erroneous knowledge that had been offered, like, your African brothers and sisters sold you into slavery, those kinds of things that disrupt our sense of who we are. So for a year, my students and I did this after-school program, developed a curriculum that's represented from the Nile to the Niger to the neighborhood. Young people learned how to do research, interviewing folks in the neighborhood. It was a pedagogical lab. So for every class that one of the graduate students taught, there was somebody also observing, noting how this information was received by the children. And then we would analyze and look at our pedagogy systematically to see what's working. So the Songhai language has some key words that will help us to better understand who we are. My husband is a Songhai scholar, educator, and chief, and he was working with us. He has a book about the journey of the Songhai people in his own words. And so we were able to use his research to use the language pedagogically. I'll just give one example. The Songhai word for God is Irkoi. It's a compound word, Irkoy. And when you break it down, it means our God in us.
Yeah, that's different.
That's very different.
That's very different.
So it's not only Songhai language, it's what Diop did when he looked at the correspondence between Wolof and ancient Kemetic language. I mean, these are the tools that we can use to bring what we call a Black perspective into useful, meaningful experiences for our people. So those are some of the things that I've written about, and it's not rocket science. It's just say, okay, what is a Black perspective and how do we know what we know?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Um, so that kind of leads to the next question that I have, which is, how do these things play out in the classroom, your classrooms, right? So you are in the College of Education in Human Development. You teach teachers. How does Black studies and this commitment to a Black perspective, how does that inform your classrooms?
I think anything that you do as an intellectual, from my perspective, and as a Black studies scholar, as we've been saying, needs to be connected to our Black life and experience, community, but also needs to be connected to practice, problem solving, and action. Or you can say political action. I served on the curriculum commission for the state of California, naively thinking that textbooks are all about what's good for children, but it's real politics. And
Mhm.
this was back in the early 90s. So here I am battling these people who produce these textbooks that are supposedly multicultural, but they're really racist when you look at it fundamentally. So I was going into a meeting, and they had armed guards at this meeting to vote on textbooks. So I called Baba Asa Hilliard. Must have been 5 o'clock in the morning in Atlanta. And I asked him, I said, Baba Asa, I don't know what I'm going to do with this thing. They got these textbooks and I'm not sure what to do. And he was always so clear. He said, whatever you do, don't let them start our story with slavery. I said, okay, I can do that. So that's a whole nother story. I've written about this whole textbook battle, the work of Sylvia Winter, and how her scholarship helped me to reframe and to make that Black study perspective a tool. In my classroom, I tell that story. In my classroom, I teach a social foundations of education course at Georgia State. The first experience my students have is to watch a film, not about Black people, about what was happening with the Irish being colonized by the British, so that we can understand what oppression looks like for anybody. Then by the time we get down to the Black experience, we're not starting our story with slavery. We're talking about how oppression, colonialism, imperialism has worked for anybody.
Okay. Thank you. That is a very impactful framing, right? To start not with the Black perspective necessarily, but to have a foundation of what oppression and colonization look like. And then once you have an understanding of what that looks like, now you can see it in these other places and we can talk about it within this context around Black people specifically and all over, not just necessarily in the US. Um, which is another thing I wanted to ask about, and then I'm and then I'm going to get to the last two formal questions that I sent to you that I have. But something that definitely comes up a lot is the importance of diaspora literacy and heritage knowledge. And I really was struck by um, heritage knowledge as like that group memory, that collective memory. How how do I want to ask this question? Um, are there ways that you think work well to integrate the importance of heritage knowledge into our classes, particularly right now when there's a lot of overt pushback against Black perspectives and even just accurate history of Black people?
What we're experiencing now, for instance, we have laws on the books in many states that dictate to educators, K-12 and the university, the very words we can use in the classroom.
Mhm.
I was in a faculty meeting, and the lawyer for the university came to talk to the faculty. And I should have started this conversation with my disclaimer that I'm not representing Georgia State. I'm speaking as a private citizen and an individual. And I have to say that upon the legal advice of the lawyers at my university because of the laws that are in place in the state of Georgia.
Mhm.
In Florida, if teachers don't teach the required curriculum, which includes teaching the benefits of slavery, they can lose their teaching credential. So, heritage knowledge is a concept that I developed drawing on the work of John Henrik Clark, because when I was director of teacher education at Santa Clara University for 12 years in California through the 90s, we eventually came to understand that what we needed was cultural knowledge.
Mhm.
So that's not something that was in my graduate education, the concept of cultural knowledge. But okay, now we have cultural knowledge, how important that is. It occurred to me, well, yeah, cultural knowledge is the knowledge that teachers need to have as we're preparing them to do the kind of work that should be happening in classrooms for anybody. But heritage knowledge is what we bring and how our own experience, our group memory needs to be valued and used as a resource. So I've found over my career that I need language that works for my purpose. So heritage knowledge, dysconscious racism, these are concepts, diaspora literacy, not that I necessarily invented, but that I draw on from the body of knowledge that exists in our intellectual tradition. So how can we use heritage knowledge? We have to, first of all, understand that it exists. And then we can look for the heritage knowledge that any group has. White folks have heritage knowledge, but it's been suppressed. And they've been given some lies to tell them that they are superior. So that has to be eliminated so that they can come back and have their own humanity leading. Then we can all sit down as human beings. That's why I say we're trying to stay human.
Mhm. Thank you. Okay, so um, my next question is, what interests you most about the past of the field of Black studies, both in critical and excited senses?
I look back at my own experience of coming to know myself as an African person. And what made that possible, the teachers that I had, like St. Clair Drake, like Sylvia Winter, and the scholarship, the literature, the history that was so important in the late 60s, early 70s. I remember reading an article by C.L.R. James, talked about the suppression of the slave trade, and there are these observations that just illuminate, that just illustrate what our perspective is. So that's the history, the foundation goes all the way back. Paul Robeson, you know, there is the actual history that we need to know. That's what excites me, and that's what I try to bring to my students. I had a group of students read Mumbo Jumbo recently, Ismail Reed. Okay, well, my goodness, they couldn't even read the text because they didn't have enough background to interpret the metaphors. And so we had to decode that knowledge in order for them to have access to it so they could pass it on to somebody else. So that's what excites me. And I'm not remembering the rest of your question.
Are there things about the past of Black studies that maybe we can look back in critical senses, or things that maybe have shifted and changed over the evolution of Black studies, that weren't necessarily there in the beginning? A lot of people will talk about, like, the lack of women's voices, um, in the scholarship that initially?
Well, I've never sensed that there was a lack. What I experience is the way people come to the task and pick up what needs to be done next. So
Mhm.
there's always work to be done, more to be illuminated. Just yesterday in my class, Social Foundations of Education, we're looking at the development of the discipline of sociology, but from a Black perspective. And so I include Anna Julia Cooper. She's there.
Mhm.
Somebody may not have been lifting her up, but the reality is we've always been there. All of us have been there. Now, there's certainly room for more understanding and greater attention. I also have appreciated uh, the ways in which Black studies connects to the experiences of other populations. Vincent Harding had a line in something that he wrote. He said, "And Black studies sees with Indian eyes." Okay, well, what does that mean? That means that there are other perspectives for us also to use and understand how they relate to our own. We talk about Crispus Attucks, we need to look at his Native American heritage also.
Mhm.
There's this impulse to be fully human and to look for ways that these histories, these literatures, these representations need to be more holistic and more fully developed.
Thank you. So the last question that I have is, what interests or excites you most about the future of the field? Or maybe even, where should we be going? What's the next evolution of Black studies?
I think Black studies has always been Pan African and um, has always looked at the African diaspora as a part of our reality. And I think that today we have much more opportunity to make those aspects real through technology. I'm participating in I don't know, a blog, listserv. I'm not sure what to call it, but Molefi Asante has organized a conversation online, and you can go on there and see somebody from Ghana, somebody from another part of the world sharing their contribution to a particular topic or question. I'm working on a curriculum with Dr. Julius Garvey that the Garvey Institute is going to make available to high school students, and it will be online. So I've been working with young people in the evolution of the Songhai Club. We now have an organization or a program that we call the Guardians of Heritage. Young people studying to be researchers. And when we advanced that program, we had 22 young people in 12 cities in the US and 3 in Brazil, online, working together, doing community based research, producing mobile apps that represented their efforts to use Black knowledges in community problem solving. So, how did we do that? We were in Zoom using just like this technology that you have. We had an interpreter translating Portuguese to English. So, there are all these possibilities for us to reconnect and be who we are and use the tools that are available to us that maybe our ancestors did not have access to. But there is also that spiritual side that has always been there with us, like the story I told about Aunt Jemima. So we want to use all of our aspects to reconnect and to stay human.
Well, thank you so, so much. Is there anything that you would like to add?
Just to congratulate you on this useful affirmation of our creative and intellectual abilities. And just to encourage the listening audience to go back and pick up our poetry, Look at what the scholars were doing in the 70s. Teach that tradition, that intellectual tradition. I use the example of mumbo jumbo. If you haven't read mumbo jumbo, pick it up and try to read it. And if you can see that there's some things you can't understand, figure out how you need to catch up.
Mhm. Well, thank you so, so much. I truly appreciate you being here, and I really enjoyed speaking with you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you very much, Ashley.